Metropolitan University Deleuze Studies Journal, Amy. Today's guest is Dr. Felicity Colman, who's here with us to talk about her new book, Deleuze and Cinema, which was published in summer 2011 by Berg Publishers. Felicity is a lecturer in Screen Media at Manchester Metropolitan University. She's the editor of the book Film, Theory and Philosophy, and she has published extensively on Deleuze, aesthetics, issues of gender and politics, on screen media. Thank you, Felicity, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking how you developed the idea for this book.
Okay. Here it is. All right. Well, the book came about in a number of ways. I was asked to write a series of essays around Deleuzean ideas. I've been working on Guattari quite a lot in relation to art, and people knew I did Guattari, so they were looking for someone to write on Deleuze, and so I was using Deleuze's ideas in my teaching. I guess I was teaching quite formal film history and theory, fairly standard textbook stuff, and I was using a lot of David Bordwell's work, which is quite useful work and great to teach with, but it has a particular kind of cognitivist methodology, very formal methodology. And I started to see that there were correlations, well, I thought there were a lot of correlations between what Deleuze was doing in these two books, I love my analog objects, and what Bordwell was doing. And I sort of started to play around with ideas in my teaching, I guess in quite tacit ways, not telling the students what I was doing, but using a Deleuzean methodology, I guess, an approach for how to think about ideas. Because one of the things that really interested me was, you know, when you kind of watch a film and it's really, it's engaging, you don't know really what it's about. The first time you might watch it, say something like Pasolini's Teorama or Pasolini's Salo, and you can look up the cinema books, you know, for a canonic text like that, and Deleuze just says, you know, one sentence, half a sentence about that, and it's like, oh yeah, and suddenly a whole world kind of opens up, and I was really interested to figure out how that actually worked. So, you know, kind of agreed to do this book, and then started to really pull the books apart, and of course what I thought I was going to find, I didn't find that at all. I found something else. It emerged that it is a formalist system. It's very technical, and this book I've written is very technical. But it surprised me actually how kind of into that technicality I really got, and how you know, where it came from. So to read these books, and you know, you probably had a similar experience. You know, people say to you all the time, these are the two books that philosophers don't read. And these are the two books that supervising a lot of film students, they wouldn't read them either. They'd do their dissertation by looking at 1,000 Plateaus, or Difference and Repetition, or Bergsonism, or What is Philosophy, but they tend to avoid these books because they're like, what are they? You know, so they're like the anomaly. So it was a challenge, you know, in a few terms, a few different ways. So. Does that answer the question?
Would you like to say a bit more about what the two books offer to the area of screen
studies? Yeah. Well, they offer, I guess, to elaborate on what I was just saying, they offer a way into thinking about film analysis and screen analysis. Screen meaning, and I use the term screen media in here, which sort of means anything that you can see on a screen, including, you know, reading a newspaper, listening to the radio, but looking at, you know, abstract images, perhaps television, films of all kinds, art films, you know, galleries, anything that's sort of a moving image on screen. I think Deleuze's approach, because he's really drawn from Bergson, and Bergson's idea of what the cinematic apparatus can do for our brains and thinking about how we interpret the world. There's this kind of mediatisation that occurs, and Deleuze sets up this system, it's an open system, that you can then apply to all forms of media that use screen-based media. So while he uses very specific examples, and he has been criticised for using those canonic examples that he was seeing when he was going to the Cinematheque in Paris, I think, and I hope I've demonstrated in the book, that they are applicable to a broader range, but also to think about what are the implications for cinematic thinking. So it offers a different way of approaching screen analysis that might or previously screen analysis, film theory that's, it's a young discipline. It's tended to rely on one type of methodological approach, so it might be, okay, I'm using a cognitive approach, or I'm using a semiotic approach, or I'm using a psychoanalytic approach, and this way kind of connects all of those disciplines plus others, and it really is a kind of a transdisciplinary approach that enables you to talk about the technological platforms of the screen media as well as the content that they're generating and how they kind of feed into each other. Mm-hmm. So it's like reinventing the discipline, really, plugging into other areas as filmmakers do. So I think it's probably more appropriate.
Thank you. In each of the book's chapters, you handle the Deleuzean concept by asking what that concept is, what it does, and how Deleuze uses it. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about our selection of concepts as tools for use in film analysis?
Sure. Well, for this, I was really driven by Deleuze's own selection. So, and in actual fact, the book was meant to be probably about twice as long as it is, but I ran out of space because I wrote too much. So there are only actually 14 chapters, 15 chapters, but in fact there's meant to be 20 chapters. So missing things like a chapter on sound, and I've still got them, but they just haven't been published. Maybe in an updated future version. But if you look at the contents page of cinema books, I follow Deleuze's kind of thinking as he goes, because he says at the beginning quite provocatively, and I think that's where I end the book, we have to start with definitions, although basic definitions, although we'll probably revise them as we go along. And it's a very clever, tight structure for constructing a book. So my book really does follow this, what is he talking about? What is the cine system, frame shot, a cut, montage, movement? And I wanted to spend quite a bit of time looking at the elements of the movement image, because in a lot of secondary English discussions of Deleuze and the cinema books, and there's sort of a handful of very good books, people tend to focus on the time image on the second book and less so on the movement image. And I thought it was important to emphasise that you can of course select what you want, whatever you're interested in, but you need to be able to be aware of where those connections are arising from and how implicit the movement image is in the time image. So it's just really following through each of the chapters. So there's a logic in this book. The parts where I've had to edit for the sake of economy for the length of publication, which is required by the publisher, I've consolidated, for better or worse, into some sort of overarching concepts like trans-semiotics or politics, although Deleuze talks about politics, or thought, or there could have been another one on just the image, in the sense of underwriting these books is Deleuze's meditation on Bergson's image. What is an image, and how does it kind of conceptualise the world, I guess, and diagrammatise the world, which he talks about a lot in Bergsonism. That's another book. It's pretty logical and chronological, but then there are those overarching themes which are meant to kind of signpost for readers, well, here's what you could do with these concepts. I've taken poetic license, you should too. Feel free to invent.
Thank you. So the Deleuze cinema books are rich with neologisms and new concepts. And what is this proliferation intended to, and what does this multiplicity entail while using it as a theoretical springboard?
I think it arises out of the neologisms can be difficult and they can be obtuse. They can be fun as well, but then you can be labelled, sort of. There's that Deleuzean in the corner when you're using the new sphere or the lines of flight or some of those kinds of concepts. But some gradually have become, embedded in the parlance. I mean, they're just figures of speech that enable us, I think, to do technical things or sort of talk about, paradigms or discourses or however you want to phrase it, fields of thinking. So things like rhizomic thinking or a rhizomic approach, people sort of generally know what that is, although they might apply it in different ways. So it's, in the same way that, say, Jean-Francois Lyotard uses, discourse of figure, or Lacan uses, the object petit a, or they're just kind of, they're technical modalities to enable us to switch into thinking about things in a different way. And a lot of the neologisms here and how they kind of arise come about through the work that Deleuze and Guattari have done in 1,000 Plateaus. And, I'd probably advise people to read parts of that with this. I hope I've signposted as much as I could, where my thinking, or where Deleuze's thinking is coming from in here. And I've tried to connect some of the dots, really, in explaining, or, demonstrating how the neologisms work. And I mean, really, these books are about what I've termed in here transsemiotics, and the transsemiotic system that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in here. So it's a proliferation of signs. Yeah. There's the movement sign and there's the time signs, and an infinite number that you can have variations of those as they encounter each other in different kinds of films and as they interact through different kinds of signalic fields. Or, I've talked about, there's one chapter where I've given over to one of the signs where I've talked about vectors. And vectors is just, that's just a moment that happens, or, you could describe it as the moment of transformation, or is it a moment of mutation, or is it a moment of whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. It's just they're kind of useful. There's also, what I did try to do was include a glossary at the back of here, which in actual fact I could just have a book like it's the glossary, the Deleuze dictionary. Yeah. Adrian Parr's Deleuze dictionary does that quite well. But, even how, I guess, that's one thing about neologisms. Again, there is no law. Here's, you could say, here's how Deleuze phrases it, but in actual fact, the way that I'm applying it here, I'm going to say this. So, the glossary kind of indicates some of the more difficult ones. And also I'm aware that there are neologisms that I've tried to put in here that come from film theory that Deleuze uses, some that Deleuze uses and some that he doesn't. That in film theory, say, we talk about the diegesis all the time, or the extra diegetic form, and or the Suzette and the Fabula, or those kinds of things. And Deleuze doesn't use the word diegesis, and there are reasons why he doesn't. But in terms of the discipline of film theory, that's a neologism that is accepted in the same way that I think rhizomic thinking about a film has been accepted. So, yeah, I could talk about this for a while, actually.
Can you say something about transsemiotics as a methodology? How does Deleuze's cinematic sign system, if it is accurate to call it a system, diverge from previous semiological models?
That's a good question. The transsemiotic system, this is what I've named it. Deleuze talks about transsemiotics with Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, in it's Plateau 5, in the plateau where they talk about the proliferation of signs. And it's really interesting now to read Guattari's diary on the writing of these books, because you can sort of see him fitting into this area, and because he was working on the whole issue of describing the processes of subjectification of subjectivity, like he calls it the meta-modelization of subjectivity, like the way that different institutions in the world, family, church, education systems, kind of impose an order on subjectivity. So they talk a lot about that ordering, and they talk a lot about order words, for instance. And Deleuze invokes this conversation throughout the cinema books. And trans-semiotics is an overarching term that Deleuze kind of leaves out of the cinema books, but he refers to, because he refers to what's happened in 1,000 Plateaus. And if you look at that plateau, there they talk about the way that for us to devise a new kind of way of thinking about subjectification of all forms, not just of people, but of all things in the world, they start to broach their idea of the schizoanalytic model. And for that to happen, they say we need to think about the mix of signs, the mix of semiotics that actually feeds into the way that we're thinking. And you can see Deleuze plugging this into how he's talking about different kinds of aspects of films. And I think this is the core to it, actually. So there they talk about how if we take, instead of just taking, one sign of something, of course there are signification, signs of, things in the world, and we're kind of attuned to that, bad boy, good girl, good girl, bad boy, sort of that sort of thing. But instead of sort of limiting it to just one sign, what if we approach it as a mixed semiotic or a rhizomic method in the way that the cinema does? So you're not just taking one aspect, but you're mixing it up. And then the mix that they talk about in Plateau 5 is of, it can be a number of things. It could be generative, it could be transformative, it could be diagrammatic, and there's a fourth one, which has gone out of my head. It could be machinic. Mm-hmm. And of those four things, generative, transformative, diagrammatic, and machinic, then they kind of give examples of those. And you can see Deleuze talking about examples of those. He talks a lot about transformative signs in the cinema books. And I sort of devote one chapter to that, like he's really into vampire films. He talks about Nosferatu in a really nice way, like, the sun rises and something happens. There's a transformation in the world, between all the kind of mutable elements. It's not just about people, you can see the kind of the mists rising from the earth, and you can smell the mud, and it's all quite spooky. Mm-hmm. But it's, there's that transformative element, but then that is generative of something else. And then, it can be, those are two Deleuzean terms, and then the machinic and the diagrammatic Guattarian terms. So they're sort of less plugged into the cinema books, but you can see them there, and they do talk about abstract machines and concrete machines later on in 1,000 Plateaus. So it's sort of like one of the issues with cinema books and thinking about those kinds of systems is that, I guess, you can just read these straight, but it helps if you read the other books as well. But yeah, I guess that trans-semiotic system it's also a really rich system for looking at. And I've tried to sort of indicate areas that you could go. I think it's a really rich area for feminist thinking, actually thinking about this new kind of a trans-semiotic system in a way of talking about, say, the diagrammatization of feminicity in the world, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a useful tool.
Yeah. In the book, you argue that Deleuze's cinema project entails a firm political philosophy. Mm-hmm. In that cinema is a medium that can inspire critical thinking, and you further expand this category to screen media. Mm-hmm. Can any film inspire political or philosophical thought, or can a formulaic film be equally suggestive and viewed differently?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is yes. I see every film, and I think Deleuze sees every film as political. Every film has its own political position. You know, whether it's the latest Hollywood blockbuster or some, you know, small art film, it has its own economy, I guess. It's chosen certain elements in the framing of those elements and in the choices that it's made, the sounds that it's incorporated, the figures, whether it's abstract or representative. It's talking about a certain position in the world. So, Deleuze does a very interesting thing where he talks about kinds of political cinema towards the end of the second cinema book. And he develops his thinking there again from work that he's done with Guattari in their book on Kafka, where they talk about the minor literature. And I think that's a really rich area that you could do, again, a lot of things with, and people like David Martin Jones, who's a scholar who's done a lot of work around that area and developed some of the concepts that Deleuze sort of broaches. Again, it's a really, I think one of the things about the books is that it's sort of there and the concepts are there and you can take them and use them how you need to use them. But the political terms are quite explicitly stated. I mean, Deleuze does, again, and it's part of the political project, and I guess implicit with that is the aesthetics of film, the aesthetics of film rather, the question of, you know, he's engaging in the philosophical terms of Kantian terms of engagement, judgment, whether we make a judgment about something to be true or false. And he reminds the reader throughout that these are terms of value judgments, that, you know, you're asking the wrong kind of questions if you're asking about those kinds of ethics. So instead, to look at what is within the film and what is it generating, what are the politics that are immanent within it, and how then might they be speaking to different societies, different communities, different groups of people. Often the films that are the most politically oriented, that we might say, that are about, atrocities that have happened in the world, there is an absent people because it's about those people that don't exist anymore because they've been killed or a genocide has taken place. So there's a kind of a testimonial. And again, there are ways in which other scholars have developed that more fully.
To conclude, I'd like to ask what is Deleuze's cinematographic ethics?
Okay. In the conclusion, I talk about Deleuze's cinematographic ethics in a way that I think opens more questions than answers them, which is as it should be. There are a number of issues. Again, I refer the reader back to Difference in Repetition, where he talks about two principles that for him are sort of important to understand, I guess, the ethics of life. I mean that in a sort of Bergsonian sense. He talks about the principles of indiscernibility and he talks about the principles of differentiation. And it's the aspect of differentiation that he really develops throughout the cinema books, and that's along Foucauldian lines to do with terms of control and power, developing ideas around semiotic systems or semiologies, but thinking about the way that life is determined through different modes of power, modalities of power, and how they might end up controlling us, and how they're implicit within cinema. And he does, I guess, Deleuze really rejects a lot of cinema. When we're talking about the sort of the politics, or the idea of a political cinema, he does reject a lot of what he sees in cinema as being not political enough, or not engaging enough with what the world is actually about. So there are questions to do with thinking about how the cinema purports to represent a reality, but in actual fact, reality is something that we give a name to and determine through often false means. And one of the things we haven't talked about actually, which I should just mention here, is that to develop this idea of falsity, he's not only looking back to Bergson and his Spinoza, which he's already written 2 books about to talk about the politics of affect and ethical movements there. But he looks very much to filmmakers, and one of the key filmmakers that's quite surprisingly present in all the way through both books is Wim Wenders, German filmmaker. And he starts off and ends with talking about Wenders' film False Movement, which you can probably say in German.
False Movement.
Yeah, so, and that really gets him thinking about, okay, well, how do we describe reality? It's about images in movement, and it's all implicit in Wenders' films. And I mean, you look at Wenders' films now and they seem really, they're of their time, and they are quite sort of ponderous in some of their movements. But they are a real meditation on cinema as a technological platform, as well as the content that it can then kind of generate about the world. So the sense of movement is really implicit in his ethics, and it's kind of it's quite an interesting area. I mean, again, I think that's another book that needs to be kind of fleshed out. But those elements are the key ones for thinking about what his ethics are.
I think that's right. And what are you working on, or what will you be working on?
Surprisingly, maybe unsurprisingly, I'm working on thinking about a feminist semiotics, and that's a book project, and looking at Bergson and Film, because I was really quite adamant before I started this book that Deleuze was drawing from not just Bergson, but a proliferation of directors, philosophers, and I guess his peers and thinkers about cinema. But what I didn't realise, and which John Larky's always talked about, is how implicit Bergson's thinking is. So I want to really go, although Deleuze does a different thing and he kind of critiques Bergson throughout, but I didn't go into that in this book because it's a different kind of philosophical argument. So I need to look at Bergson in more philosophical terms.
That's great. Thank
you very much.